Good afternoon. This is Wednesday, January 25th, 2023. I'm Dan Hammermesh, and today I have with me three experts on education, even higher education, to talk about some very general issues in higher education. These experts are Susanna Loeb, who's just becoming a professor of education at Stanford University. Congratulations on the big move. Doug Weber, who's a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and John Winters, who's a professor of economics at Iowa State University, one of my favorite colleges to visit. I've been there a couple of times for strange reasons. Anyway, thanks for being with me this afternoon, folks. And
thanks for having us.
A pleasure. Let me start off with Susanna just to respond to the first question. I mean, one of the real staples of labor economics is measuring the rate of return to higher education, the monetary return. My guess is most of the folks in this panel have done that at least once. The question is, we observe this, is it really a result of marketable skills that the people have gotten in universities, or is it just all measurement and nothing real going on there? Susanna, what do you think?
I think a lot of people have tried to throw a lot of techniques at trying to understand whether the higher returns to higher education, the fact that people who graduate from college earn so much more than others is due to who goes into college or due to the effects of college. And we may get conflicting reviews here, but I think overwhelmingly it looks like it actually does have something to do with the kinds of skills that you learn as a college student. There may be some benefits too that you get from college that are just signaling effects, that just because you demonstrate that you can do college. But I think in general, the research really does show that each year of college gives you something more, and that college as a whole has an average return to people that is really quite high.
Right. Doug, what do you think?
I completely agree. And this is going to be a gross oversimplification of tons and tons of research, but if I were to try to boil it down to just a few numbers, I'd say that the literature says 2/3 of the measured return to college is something like human capital, and 1/3 would be something like signaling. Now, that's going to be different across different majors and different that in some majors, I think it's probably pretty much all human capital. In others, it's probably a lot more signaling. And that's also different across, the school that you go to. But I think overall, the message is, this is a causal effect. This is there's something about what people are learning in college that is actually raising students' productivity, and the average return over a lifetime to a college degree is $1 million. So even if we're knocking that down to 2/3, we're still talking about a lot of money.
Major dollars. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I'm sure there's some cases we could think of where maybe it isn't a good investment, this or that. But overall, when done well, right, higher education should make you a better thinker, a better problem solver, and a better communicator. And those things should make you more productive and help increase your salary. Some of the other things that I think is important is it's also about networking, right? We kind of know that you go, you meet people, that can be a big part. But there's also a maturation process that goes on that, we take, or when I went to college, I just hit my 18th birthday, right? We take these 18-year-old kids, and they develop. And so part of that obviously happens in the classroom, but a lot of that maturation, a lot of the networking happens outside the classroom. So there's obviously tons of benefits. And again, I agree, there's some signaling. I think Doug's, best estimate of 2/3 of it's probably human capital. I think that's, a very good best estimate. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's very reasonable.
In some ways, this is very optimistic and sort of patting ourselves in the back, which is
sure.
For that.
If we don't, who will?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. On the other hand, I went to the University of Chicago, where I can assure you, in the early 60s when I was there, nobody gave a hoot about marketable skills. And I think Chicago probably almost more than any other place in the country doesn't care about that. My question is, start off with Doug. Should we even worry about marketable skills?
I think we should. I think one of the, I'll give two reasons why we should. One is college is very expensive. I don't have to, I'm sure I don't have to highlight that. The other one, though, is that I don't think that people should make decisions about going to college based solely on the average premium, because most people are not getting the average. Many are getting higher, many are getting much lower. What I've tried to do in a lot of my work is put forward the idea that the decision to go to college, it's about risk, and the probability of it paying off, and it's very likely to pay off, but it's not always going to. And so I think because there is this non-trivial risk of it not paying off, I do think that it's important to from just doing right by the student's perspective, that we should care about the labor market outcomes, and are we actually teaching things that are connected to the labor market.
Nice way of looking at it. John, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm someone that teaches at a public university, and specifically at a land-grant university, and I've spent all my entire career at public universities, and a good chunk of it at land-grant universities. I do think, yes, we have a public commission that people should, develop skills. Now, what exactly a marketable skill is, that's a hard thing to know, right? I don't think anyone has exactly a precise definition. And if we tried to quantify that, like in a binary, yes or no, I think we would all come up with different. But I think the overarching, emphasis should be that, yeah, a big part of the mission is marketable skills. We want to actually, confer skills that can help people get jobs. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody has to be an engineer, right? Or finance or econ major. I'm not saying that. But I think at their core, public universities should be focused on at least some broad notion of marketable skills.
Susanna, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's an importance of marketable skills. I think there are also an importance of skills that have societal returns. So the kinds of skills that allow people to lead healthier lives or contribute to their community or things like that, that all have these public payouts. And I think one of the reasons that we would like to worry about this is because we think that it's a good thing for society, both for the individual, but also for others to have higher education. And that's why we put some public money into it. I think there's the risk about higher education, but there's also things that are predictable that we could do to really help with the marketable skills and the other kinds of skills that we care about. One of the examples is that there's different returns to different kinds of majors. And so you really want to make sure that people are choosing the majors that are good for them. And, they may choose to be an English major instead of an economics major because they value the outcomes that you get from being an English major. I think that's totally fine. But when they don't have complete information, or whether we've made it really miserable just in that, couple of years to be an econ major, if there are things like that that are malleable, then there's a reason that we want to know about these things, because then we can do things as policymakers to try to end up with better outcomes for the individuals as well as for the society as a whole.
I was thinking about my own career in public higher ed at Michigan State and UT Austin. And UT Austin now we're charging $11,000 or $12,000 per year tuition, okay, which ain't cheap. And the people in the state, if they knew that most of the kids going there come from very high income families, and again, UT Austin's a special case, it's one of the premier public schools, they'd be even more upset about subsidizing this education than they already are. How do you convince the taxpayer? And Iowa's the same way, I know for sure, but probably the same as Texas. How do you convince them to pay for this, which is a large chunk of state budgets? Let's see, who wants to go first? Susanna, why don't you go first? Then John, then Doug.
Well, I do think, just like we were talking about before, there's good evidence that there are societal benefits as well as individual benefits. So that's certainly one reason that you would pay for it. There's, more better health, lower incarceration, these things that are really important. That said, those kinds of public returns probably aren't quite as great as they are in K-12. And so you would worry about that. I do think that's why we think when we subsidize higher education that maybe we would do it more on a sliding scale, essentially, that we provide this more to low students who come from lower income families or families with fewer resources, because so many of the returns to higher education really do go to that individual. Of course, then there's tricks to figuring out how to do that just right, but I'm sure we'll get into that as well.
A little bit. John, what do you say?
Yeah, so again, I think we said before, I do think that higher education creates tremendous value, and for better or worse, like, university presidents and regents, whatever, constantly kind of need to make that case. It is fair and reasonable for the public to want to, know they're getting a good return on their investment and see value created. But I guess this is the thing where I think, for better or worse, it is often, in our current culture, I think it's often fun to kind of like find examples where higher education doesn't work well and kind of highlight those, focus the attention on those. And so I think it's a case where, okay, if 80% of the time or even 90% of the time or whatever, higher ed is going great, but then there's a 10% where, or areas where it's not so great. I think a lot of people in media, et cetera, like to go, oh, look, higher ed messed up. And so it's kind of a gotcha kind of thing. And that may be partially because, academics are, we're highly educated, and occasionally maybe we deserve a little bit of needling sometimes, right? Maybe we're not the most pleasant to be around. Maybe we're a little full of ourselves sometimes.
Not all academics are like economists. Let's be careful.
I'm sorry. But, to some extent, I think there is this, there's this, like, I don't know, right? There's this gut desire to bring the smarty pantses down a little bit. And so when higher ed doesn't succeed, I think a lot of people like to publicize that fact. And again, my point about higher ed is that we actually have to say, okay, yes, there are some things where we need to improve. Absolutely. But there are a lot of places where we're doing very well, and the system's doing well, and that we need to, just megaphone those successes.
Doug, you're the only person on the panel who's in the real world. That's not academia. How do we do this? How do we megaphone them, to use John's terms, to get people to buy into this endeavor? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, so one thing, and I'll just mention that nothing that I'm saying here is necessarily representing what any policy that the Fed is endorsing. I'll also mention that I spent 10 years at a public university, and so I've thought a lot about these issues. One thing that I'll mention is that there is no single engine of upward economic mobility like higher education. There's no investment that exists that has anywhere near this type of return and this high of a likelihood of a return. So it is, at this point, almost a de facto requirement for entry into the middle class. And that's a really important thing to recognize, that you will certainly see people point to individual, there are good welding jobs. And it's true, there are good welding jobs, but there are actually not all that many of them. That when you look at the, where most good jobs are and what they require education beyond high school. Now, this does not necessarily mean a 4-year college liberal arts degree. There's certainly a lot more nuance than that. But there needs to be an investment in higher education, because otherwise there's very little path for advancement, for economic advancement for a large swath of society. The other thing that I'll mention is that, especially for people coming from lower income family backgrounds, resources matter. That if you are not at a school that is not supporting you, then your likelihood of graduation, your likelihood of getting the same amount of out of the education that those people from higher income backgrounds are, it's not there. And so that's one of the big reasons for the public to support higher ed, is because it is directly helping that upward economic mobility. Now, in terms of how to do it, I
Wait, let's hold
certainly
off
would.
on the how in a minute.
Sure,
I'll get to that'll be my
yeah,
last question. Let's not do
sure,
how.
yeah,
We're doing
sounds
what
good.
so far. A question I hadn't told you beforehand. I think about higher ed in Europe, okay, not the UK, but in Germany, France, Netherlands, which I know fairly well. It's basically no direct charge to people to go to university there. Bernie Sanders would love to do that. What do you think about that? Let's start with John, then Susanna, and then Doug. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say overall, I do believe the U.S. has the best overall higher education system in the world. That doesn't mean we can't make improvements. One of the immediate obvious concern, if you said, let's just do away with payment altogether, who's going to pay for it then, right? And so that's a big concern, right? If we think about just cutting out, whatever resources, I don't know how we get from where we are to there very easily. So that's my first hesitation. Do I think higher education is maybe getting a little too expensive in some places? Maybe so. And so, could we invest more in it? Possibly. Susanna mentioned, again, I do agree. And again, Doug's comment about social mobility, I do agree that to some extent, higher ed is still somewhat inaccessible to people, from more lower and middle income backgrounds. And so I would like to see it become more affordable there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's free for everybody. But if you had, if you said, okay, yeah, again, I'll reiterate Doug's, none of my views are the views of my employer, but I don't think my employer will disagree with this. If you had an opportunity to say significantly expand the Pell Grant so that, we could provide larger Pell Grants and more people could get it, make it more affordable, right? I think on net, that would probably be a good thing. Now, again, that, where does that money come from? That's another discussion.
Susanna, what do you think?
Yeah, so if we had an incredible safety net in this country, then maybe it would make sense to provide higher education because it has such good returns to everybody for free. But I think if we did it now, it would be a really regressive policy. We would be putting a lot of money into people who are already going to be making a lot of money. The reason that you want serious investment in higher education, though, is that even though it really is our best way of getting skills to people and so that they're marketable, for the individual, there's a risk. And as a result, some people aren't willing to take that risk and they aren't able to take that risk. And also the returns come later in life. So they don't have the money now to put money in. If you're lower income or your family's lower income, you don't have that money to pay for tuition. So you have to find a way to take loans out to do that. And loans will be very expensive because the bank can't take the money back. The government could do that in loans, but as it's turned out, it's really hard to do that. And I think it's hard to do that because just loans are a hard thing to manage, but also because the people who take out loans may be the ones who would be less likely to use them. And also, it's really discouraging. There are many communities that see a loan, worry about the risk, and won't take it. And so I think we're in a situation now where not enough lower income families are investing or are going into higher education. And one way that it seems possible that they would is to pay for it directly. So I think you don't want to pay for it for everyone. Ideally, if the world worked like an economic model, you'd probably want to give it at loans, but it really doesn't work like a basic economic model. People do worry about loans. There are really reasons people don't want to take them because of that. And because of just the transitional costs of having loans, I think it really makes sense to actually make college relatively inexpensive or free for people from lower income families.
Doug?
So let me, so I obviously completely agree with everything that was just said, but let me more directly address the differences between the US and some of the European systems. So this is a common question. Well, they're making it free or virtually free for everyone. Why can't we do that? Well, they cut off access much earlier. People don't realize how the strides that the U.S. has made in terms of improving access to higher education, and how much greater the access is here than it is in many European countries, that we could very easily pay for it and have it free here if we restricted access in the same way that European countries do. We've said, no, that's not the right way to do it. We're not going to track people at a very early age and say, no, you're not going to this system. We want it to be open for everyone, but that makes the funding problem of it a lot harder than it does when you restrict it to the people who disproportionately already have a lot of advantages. And so that's why we have such a complicated system of cross-subsidization, and everyone's paying a different price than everyone else, is to try to balance this aspect of we want to maximize access as well as try to maximize quality, and that's a hard thing to do. So it's easy to say, well, we should just make it free like other places, but if we were to do that, that would require some trade-offs.
Okay, I was going to ask you a whole bunch of different things about what to do, but let me just ask you to comment on one specific thing. It's an idea from Milton Friedman and Jim Tobin going back to the 50s now. It's been introduced in Australia. My very good friend Bruce Chapman is the architect of what's called the HECS in Australia. These are income contingent loans. We'll give you a loan. You pay it back as a fraction of your income. So if you make a lot of money, you pay back a lot. If you make little, you pay back little. Why can't we do that here? We have tracked. People aren't going to escape the system. John, then Doug, and then we'll finish up with Susanna. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say so. These sometimes called income share agreements. Purdue University was one of the big early adopters, and some other universities. I think I was early on optimistic, and I haven't followed that case closely enough to know what's happened, but it appears to have lost steam. So it's a great question as to what the issues are. I think one of the things goes back to what Susanna said earlier. I think one of the real challenges is that if we're talking about 17, 18-year-old kids, they do not necessarily have the financial savvy to make these really big decisions. And so again, I'm someone that, again, when I was 17 or 18 years old, the idea of taking out a bunch of loans was incredibly scary to me, right? And I personally, I didn't have to right away, so that was very good for me. But the same thing with this income share agreement, if you're a 17, 18-year-old kid that knows nothing about this financial product, we're always worried about what's in the fine print. And so that, again, I think it's like one of those really smart people said, oh, this would be a great solution because we can make some improvements but the problem is when you put this decision on 17 or 18-year-old kids that are not financially savvy, that do not have familiarity with this financial product, it just seems like it's not going to work well overall. So that's now, if we talk about professional degrees, could you do this for an MBA or something? I would be more supportive there, right? If we get into people who are older, more mature, more financial savvy, I think, there's a lot of opportunities. But when we're talking about 17, 18-year-olds, I just don't see that as the path that's going to take us to the next level.
But they do this in Australia, and it's viewed as a tremendous success. I mean, my relatives there, it's automatic that they think about this for their kids and grandchildren. So why shouldn't we go in? Doug, any thoughts on that? Let me pester you.
Yes. So let me differentiate between what Australia does and the models that are being proposed in the U.S. So one thing that might be useful, there's a Philadelphia Fed researcher, her name is Dubravka Ritter. Her and I have written pretty extensively on income share agreements and both the economics behind them and the three kind of waves of use cases that they've had in the U.S. And those there's a variety of reasons why they haven't exactly taken off right now, and they're actually incredibly complicated products. The Australia case actually, that's pretty much my ideal. That what Australia does is it's not administered by private companies or in Australia, it's administered through the tax system. And this is Sue Dynarski has long kind of advocated for the Australian model, and in a much more eloquent and smart way than I could. But I think that's absolutely the way to go, where if you, the public higher ed is, fully subsidized there, but then anyone who takes advantage of it, it is, for the rest of their life, they have a slightly higher marginal tax rate. That's an ideal way to go about it. And I think the reasons that we don't move to that model are more political than anything else. I would love it if we move to that model.
You don't think the Congress should approve giving more power to the IRS for this purpose?
I absolutely am not going to. I am not going to touch that, given given my position. So,
Susanna, what do you think? Let's finish up with you on this, or any other thought you might have to make things better.
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight one thing, which was the decision-making of 18-year-olds or college students. I think that part of it is the financial savvy, but I do also think that sometimes students in college will overweight the immediate. So they'll overweight their immediate salary when they get out of college. They'll overweight, I think, even more importantly, how difficult a course is, or a series of courses if you want to do a major. As a result, I think we should be thinking about some of those kinds of things when we're trying to improve outcomes in higher education, things like transparency, information about the returns to different fields in the long run, and not necessarily the immediate job. But I also think we could do a better job of making some of the high return fields basically easier to go through, more fun to go through. And that may seem kind of like a small thing, but you could really, I'm disappointed in the US of how little math, for example, students do in college. And in part, I think that's because it's just not very much fun. But, as someone who loves math, I think math could be really fun, and we could get a lot more people that had really quite a bit stronger numeracy, quite a bit stronger economics, for example, if we made those courses more accessible. So I think thinking about the decisions that college students make and how we can help them make decisions that they would be happy to have made 10 years later, I think is what we want to do. It's not that we want to take people who want to contribute incredible art and change that, because that's something that's really important for our society. But if they just don't want to take a course because that's kind of getting in the way of things, let's try to make it, one, clearer that course is important, and two, make that course easier to go through in a positive way and still get some of those outcomes.
I guess the overall conclusion from this session is, one, we need to do a better job selling what we sell. And two, as part of that, getting information to 18-year-olds. I don't know how many of you have had 18-year-old kids in your house. Susanna, you might have.
I have, yes.
I mean, I think my 18-year-olds, which is now 30-some years ago, were incredibly with it. But I don't think, since their father was a professor and their mother's a lawyer, that that's a typical situation. Is that a fair statement, folks?
I think it is.
Okay, a sorry system indeed. Anyway, look, it's a pleasure having all three of you today. Susanna Loeb of Stanford, Doug Weber of the Board of Governors, John Winters of Iowa State. Thanks a lot for being here, folks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.